What have I done?
After biting off way more than I could chew trying to write this review episode by episode, I decided to restructure it into a series of short essays on more focused topics, and even after scaling it back to that, Cthulhu help me. I'd rather not bloat this thing any further than I already have, so let's just start. After one quick disclaimer. I talk about this show a lot because I am a RWBY fan, and that means that I'm rooting for it. I give feedback because I want it to be good. However, some people give quote-unquote feedback on art under the guise of criticism or whatever, when really they just want the sense of smug superiority that comes from tearing something down. Sometimes they make good points anyway, but I do feel like that approach leads to a lot of unnecessary negativity and a lot of misrepresenting the work in order to invent problems that aren't really there. Granted, half the reason I make these videos is to congratulate myself on being born with better taste than everybody else, so I won't judge. But we aren't here to pretend we're smarter than the people whose job it is to actually make the show. We're here because feedback is valuable for artists, and because a good piece of criticism can help you understand why you feel the way you do about a piece of art. Hopefully I can provide that for you, but I won't do it sitting around in this disclaimer all day, so let's do the Blizzic Presents thing and get started already. If you want the short version, RWBY Volume 8 is... well, it was alright. I love the way this volume is structured. This isn't the first time that RWBY has done something similar, but the blend of episodic and serialized storytelling is really effective, and is honestly something I would love the team behind Castlevania to take note of. Jumping from storyline to storyline and advancing them each a little at a time is obviously a necessity of serialized storytelling, but when you have these episodes where each storyline gets advanced an eensy bit and maybe one or two exciting things happen right at the end, only for it to immediately calm down as soon as the next episode starts, you run the risk of the audience feeling like you're stalling. This is a complaint that I often go back to with some of the episodes of the Mistral arc. It often feels like they're afraid to have anything pop off earlier in the volume because it might overshadow the climax by being more intense than the concluding episodes, which is an understandable instinct, but what that really creates is a deeply unsatisfying structure where characters are standing around doing nothing of consequence for the entire beginning, and then a bunch of crazy-ass shit happens in such rapid succession that you can't even take the time to appreciate each separate piece. So, to fix that, Volume 8 brings in some episodic structures. We get little scenes of storylines unrelated to the current episode scattered about to set things up and remind us what characters are doing, but nearly every episode until the wild-ass climax is primarily focused on telling a singular short story that works on its own. Short stories with their own build-up and climaxes. Not every episodic story is perfect, but it makes every episode feel important because the action and consequence aren't all sequestered at the end of the volume. And yet there's still a sense of building intensity as the volume climbs to its final moments. That's not an easy balance to strike, but they do an excellent job pacing out the moments of intensity so that they don't overwhelm us while still keeping us on edge. And on the topic of structure, they decided to handle RWBY's highly persistent problem of having too many key characters by literally splitting the characters up, which was probably a good call, not like we have dorm rooms or separate team assignments to do it for us these days. It seemed a little random when we first saw it during the trailer, but the way the groups are split up actually makes a lot of sense, particularly for Ren and Nora. You'd assume that Nora would be the one defending Mantle since she was the one advocating for it in Volume 7, but what this disagreement between her and Ren reveals is that she's always been the one fighting for everyone instead of just doing damage control. This divide isn't just about opposing visions of what to do, but also the opposing philosophies of optimism and pessimism. So the central question of the volume is clear from the outset. Is it worth it all to risk the fall and fight for every life? Man, Jeff Williams' lyrics really are just thesis statements. Anyway, giving the characters opposing philosophies during a time of crisis also lends them plenty of opportunities to question themselves and spiral into angst. So let's take a closer look at how they handle that.
Oscar, you...
Ruby Rose has an arc this volume, you guys, and it's not an arc where she becomes even cooler because she's the best and we should all just put our trust in her because she rules. It's an arc about her breaking the fuck down. Hooray! Kind of weird without context that this fandom has been cheering for its main character to shatter like a 40-year-old's optimism on their birthday for a while now, but I think this development works pretty well for her, especially since it reframes the somewhat disappointing usage of the same concept in Volume 7 as merely the beginning of a larger character story. It's nothing particularly earth-shaking, but it is a clear arc, primarily achieved by showing us how each and every complicating factor in this tense situation is weighing on her. Right from the start, you can tell her sister losing faith in her really shook her, and from there it's just a gradual descent into hopeless despair, with the Hound reveal being the final nail in the coffin. It is such a refreshing change of pace to see her depressed and in need of comfort, and for Yang to be the one to provide that comfort is especially appropriate, coming in to heal a small gap that grew into a startlingly massive rift in the short time they were away from each other. And then there's Oscar taking an absolute fucking beating from the writers like a champion. Luckily, after Tom Hardy used him like a chew toy, they realized how much they were bullying my poor son, and decided to lighten his load by torturing him for several episodes. And then he exploded. Joking aside, this volume we got some relationship building between Oscar and Ozpin, which is good, because I'm pretty sure the last time we really got that was Volume 4? This little conversation in episode 2 about how Oscar was starting to feel like a member of the team and how he doesn't want to merge with Ozpin is the linchpin of this whole idea. Not only is it important setup for the role Ozpin is going to play later, but it also sets up Oscar's character arc, which, just like Volume 7, is very subtle and expressed primarily through the audience extrapolating on classic tropes, but definitely present. In fact, it mirrors Volume 4 in that it's about Oscar answering the call. In Volume 4, he's simply answering the call to adventure, accepting that he's more than a simple farmhand, and more than a simple aspiring huntsman. But here, he answers the call to be the new Ozpin, to do all the things he does. To take risks, to use magic, to lie, to manipulate, and to stare evil in the face. And get beat up a lot. With that simple premise, the show is able to build to some really fun and memorable moments, which wouldn't hit with nearly the same weight if not for Oscar expressing his reluctance to bond with Ozpin early on. And speaking of Ozpin, did you guys notice how he didn't have quite so many lines this time? I can tell that they must have pulled my exposition video up in the writer's room while they were scripting this one, because throughout the volume they utilized one of my suggested techniques for making exposition interesting, bringing the conflict to the forefront. Given that the apocalypse is about to go down, the characters are feeling pretty tense, and since they have a lot of differing opinions on how to proceed, that leads to a lot of exposition through argument, which is one of my favorite kinds. So, as the writers set up bowling pins to knock down later, they're also doing character. Remember my metaphor about spoonfuls of sugar and medicine going down? This is pretty much exactly what I mean. And even when the exposition isn't so clean, it's pretty lean, and mean, and sparkles with a beautiful sheen. It's better than it's ever been. What I'm trying to say is that it's snappy and efficient. I rarely felt like we lingered on anything longer than we needed to, and oftentimes the boring conveyance of plot information was effectively covered up with a joke or a cool cutaway or a character being their dorky self.
I can sense spikes of people's emotions, I think. It happened on Winter's ship. If I focus my aura, I can keep it up.
Okay.
I will say that episode 2's slower, less gripping pace can be attributed to the world building it does being a little longer than it needed to be, but other than that, my complaints about too much exposition are minimal. I do have a complaint about too little exposition, though. Before I get into it, props for writing this staff of creation loophole into the show so that Team RWBY and friends can break the game without pulling any unexpected plot bullshit out of their asses. But I know for a fact that I wasn't the only one whose happiness for Penny was distracted from by confusion about what exactly had just happened. Now, I don't claim to be the brightest individual. In fact, I can be quite slow. That's actually, the reason that I sound like, like a bit of like a big moron, whenever I don't have like a written like a script in front of me that I can like read from, But given that a good fifth of the commenters on the Spider-Verse video don't seem to understand the concept of hyperbole, I'm pretty sure there are people at least as stupid as me watching this show. I'm not saying that you need to dumb it down, but it's important to present supernatural concepts like this in a way that everyone you expect to be watching can follow. So I don't think it would have hurt the pacing too badly if you had slowed down and explained this a little more thoroughly. Just enough so that you could get it on your first watch rather than your second or third, and if you've got a big brain and you got it on your first watch, congratulations, that's really swell for you. Be sure to tell me all about it in the comments. I don't have a transition to the next section, so here's a harmonica. Trying to do something with Crow and Robin this volume was an obvious move given that they were about to be spending a lot of time in close proximity, and I like some of what they do here. The subtle trick of focusing on Crow when Robin says it's your fault is super effective. Even though she's actually talking to Jacques, we immediately understand that he's putting all of the weight of Clover's death on his own shoulders. Hell, that's probably why he wants revenge against Ironwood instead of Tyrion. He's angry that Ironwood made Clover turn against him, but as far as Crow is concerned, he caused Clover's death. The next scene is where it starts to fall apart, though. First of all, it's bizarre that they ended on the intriguing cliffhanger of Crow proposing an Ironwood revenge mission to Robin, and then cut back to the jail cell, and they don't even acknowledge that. It's completely ambiguous whether she agreed, or whether they have an escape plan now, or what, which I at first thought was intentional setup for a surprise, but it doesn't really amount to anything. I'm also not a fan of how Crow's little monologue turned all of the interesting subtext of the first prison scene into just regular old text. I understand wanting to clarify what happened in the Tyrion fight after the
"Please seek shelter in a calm and orderly manner"
reception it got, and it's good that he's aware of his emotions, but dude, don't explain your entire psyche, that's my job. Similarly, I can't really say I buy into this as the bonding moment between Crow and Robin that it was clearly supposed to be. Robin explains that she's felt similar emotions to him, but the two characters don't really connect. They just say their little monologues one after another, and then the scene moves on. It's like one of those bad conversations where you're both so eager to talk that you're just waiting for the next person to be done so that you can say what you want to say. I did like this, though.
Hey, Eric, look at me. Bitch.
After that, they escape from prison when the opportunity comes along and presents itself, and then comes the critical moment of Crow's arc this volume. He's off to kill Ironwood, even though he's fully aware that if anyone tries anything, Ironwood's gonna bomb Mantle, and hence, that might not be the most productive thing for them to be doing right now. Robin's little speech to change his mind is actually pretty well written and touches on all the right points, so I can't really call this arc a failure. It works. I completely buy that Crow would change his mind based on what she says. It just didn't really compel me all that much. Honestly, it might be because it felt a little too easy. After what happened throughout Volume 6 and 7, Crow working his ass off to build himself back up into an actual person, and finding some happiness only for it all to be ripped away from him anyway, in part because of his own actions, he should have been devastated. And he was, but he just kind of fixes it. This is going to be one of several times in this video that I say something would be better if there was more of it, so I need you all to understand that I'm analyzing this show critically and not from a production standpoint. Just because I think the volume would have been better if there was more stuff in it doesn't mean that that was actually possible for the staff to do. Sometimes you don't have the time and money for everything you want to do, which sometimes means the setup and payoff of certain arcs and events aren't equally weighty on both sides. It's especially understandable here, considering there was a lot of payoff this volume, wasn't there? Like seriously, a fucking avalanche of the stuff. So many things that have been alluded to and set up for literal years all culminated in this one explosive chapter of the story. Like a chain reaction. I'm gonna talk more about some of that payoff later, but firstly, I just want to address one thing. Back when Volume 7 was airing, I would cringe whenever someone said Watts might hack Penny, because not only did that wordage make the fictional technology feel overly simple, it is also the most obvious easiest plot beat you could possibly hit. It was already set up the moment a hacker character and a robot character entered the same story arc, which is exactly why I'm really happy they didn't try to surprise us with it, and instead used it to build tension for a horrible moment that we all suspected was coming. As a result, the drama they pull from it feels intense and real, rather than something copied from a TV tropes page. Additionally, the way that Penny's virus manifests is much more interesting than the obvious, overly tropey way it could have manifested that Watts lampshades later on.
I said I had Penny under control, not that I could telekinetically force her to do whatever I want.
If she had just started attacking people and helping the villains fight the heroes, and RWBY started shouting, "Penny, I know you're in there somewhere." Ugh, not that you can't do those tropes well. Hell, just recently, in a thing that I won't mention here because of spoilers, they invoked that same idea and absolutely shattered my soul into a million pieces. Tropes aren't good or bad, they're just tools, but it's hard to imagine a straightforward Watts can now control Penny situation that doesn't turn out super campy and eye-roll inducing. So instead, the virus puts her on a set path, and it's something she's capable of fighting against for reasons other than her friends shouting at her to remember all the good times we've shared. So A+ in that department. However, there are two other instances of setup that I want to touch on, specifically ones that don't quite work. Let's start with the Nora overcharge moment. I like this moment for Nora as a character, but what doesn't work is the dang door. Going into this, we, the audience, had no idea it would hurt. I don't know if Nora's displayed like a voltage limit in any of RWBY's ancillary media, but unless I'm suffering from early onset dementia, it hasn't ever been discussed in the show proper. Hell, she casually talks about getting struck by fucking lightning as her first experience with her semblance. I thought she was completely immune. So where was the indication that this regular old electric security door is worse than lightning? Nora and Weiss both seem to know it's going to hurt, but how? This isn't a matter of plot holes or not making sense, it's a matter of story function, of clarity, of sowing expectations in the audience to later reap the intended emotional response. When Nora throws herself at the door, my reaction isn't, "Oh no, she's sacrificing herself," it's, "Fucking hell yeah, that was awesome, why didn't she do that earlier?" And when she collapses and suffers from severe injuries for the rest of the volume, my reaction is, "Holy shit, where in Remnant did that come from?" The other moment that doesn't quite work results in a similar disparity between the intended reaction and the actual reaction. It's the moment where Oscar pulls out his cane to do magic against Salem and leaves you wondering what sort of spell he's going to use to prevent her from following, and I can see that your intention was to surprise us with the size of this explosion, and I'm glad you did. That was fucking awesome. I enjoyed the surprise. But you need to set that up. You can not just have a character pull a hydrogen bomb out of his ass when he gets on over his head and explain it later, especially when the only real foreshadowing was Ozpin saying the cane has a few more tricks up its sleeve 3 volumes ago. There's a term for this sort of thing. It's called Deus Ex Machina. If you're going to have something unexpected show up to suddenly save the day, or suddenly make it worse in the case of a Diabolus Ex Machina, you generally have to establish the possibility that it could show up ahead of time. Otherwise, it's like cheating, because the writers of a narrative can make anything happen whenever they want, so it's not difficult to catch the audience off guard with something they literally never could have predicted. But when you set up something intriguing, make the audience say, "Ooh, what's going on here?" and then go do something else and get them so engrossed in your conflict that they completely forget about it until suddenly, wham, it's back and it's changing everything. That is a satisfying feeling. It makes you go, "Oh, of course," instead of, "What the fuck just happened?" As fun as the surprise nuke and Nora sacrificing herself both were, both times my reaction was precisely, "What the fuck just happened?" There's a simple solution. Put an explanation about the voltage limit and the stored up kinetic energy before we see the results, and cleverly disguise it as an offhanded, unimportant detail. So, when shit goes down, you get that satisfying, "Oh, of course," while also being able to freak out about the sheer craziness of what is unfolding in front of you. But even so, no matter how much setup you do, That sheer craziness is going to be nothing compared to whatever was in the writing team's heads when they answered the question, how many redemption arcs do you want this volume? With yes. It's not that it doesn't make sense. If anything's gonna make you reevaluate who you're fighting for, it's the apocalypse. It's just a lot. And, well, some of these redemption arcs are better than others. Let's start with Hazel. In my villains video, I suggested an alternate backstory for the guy that I thought would make him a more nuanced, interesting character. Turns out that's pretty much exactly his backstory. The problem back in Volume 5, then, was that the necessity of keeping the Ozpin twist a secret forced Hazel to come off as a much more simplistic and boring character than he actually was. So now we know better. Turns out Hazel was a good character all along, except no, that's not how this works. Him being three-dimensional and interesting now doesn't make up for the fact that he was boring before we knew what his deal was. I do think we as viewers should remember that it's impossible for a story to do too many things at once and give writers some leeway, but the experience of a poorly written moment in a narrative is not erased by new information that retrospectively changes it. Hold on to that thought, because we're gonna need it again soon. And as nice as it is to have a more nuanced Hazel this volume, I do have a slight bone to pick with how his redemption is handled. Firstly, his heel face turn is much too logical for such an obviously emotional guy. As soon as Oscar proves he wasn't lying, without so much as a brief outburst, Hazel is just like, okay, I'm on your side now. But he spent the entire show so far operating on irrational anger and spite, enough of it to last him years. It's clear that Oscar and Ozpin's arguments have been getting through to him, but wouldn't it have been way easier for Hazel, emotionally, for Oscar to have been lying? Shouldn't he be feeling something? Realizing that Salem has manipulated him into working towards the destruction of humanity this entire time? You'd expect him to at least be a little upset and conflicted. I do like that he recognizes that Gretchen would have made the harder, more selfless choice in his shoes, but based on what he says to Oscar, he still doesn't seem to understand that she died because she wanted to be a huntress and not because Ozpin forced her. What is Oscar supposed to do so that there are no more Gretchens? Prevent every huntsman and huntress on the planet from being killed by the Grimm? That seems hard. The other thing I don't love about this moment is that Hazel dies, and that's just because I'm not particularly fond of the redemption equals death trope. It can be fun, and it works well enough here, but the nature of the trope is that a character who has done a lot of very bad things is redeemed by the narrative as a good guy just because he did a few good things too, usually right at the end of his life. It comes off like a cop-out, rather than actually doing the work to atone for his sins and transform himself into a better, less toxic person. He just does one or two good things and then dies. At least there isn't too much ham-fisted sorrow for him afterwards. Nobody names their children after him, although that could easily change later on. You were named after two of the bravest people I ever knew, Pyrrha Hazel. Two much less prominent but much more effective redemption stories are those of Willow and Whitley. When I first saw Whitley's official turn to the good side, I thought it was a little abrupt, but then I realized that this is actually perfect for his character. This little guy is a puppy. His life philosophy is, are my actions resulting in pets from the person I look up to? They are? Great, I'm gonna keep doing them. We saw in Volume 7 that he no longer looks up to Jacques as the untouchable, shrewd businessman and politician that he presented himself as. And at this point, his mother is still an alcoholic shut away in her room. So the only person here that he looks up to is Weiss, though he'd never admit it, just the same way that he won't admit that he was hurt when she left him behind to follow in Winter's footsteps. So when he calls a doctor out of basic human decency and Weiss rewards him with a tender hug, he decides that he could get used to this being viewed as a hero by my big sis thing, and leans into it. He leans into it pretty hard.
We can?
I can. I just need Father's computer.
And then later on, probably inspired by Whitley's bravery and by the thought of losing her children, Willow decides to get off her sorry ass and help, which works from a character perspective, but not so much from a thematic one. I know it isn't really about the booze, it's just supposed to be her coping mechanism, but this is the second time that a RWBY character has solved their alcoholism by deciding not to drink, which isn't really a super nuanced look at that particular real-world issue. But disregarding the drink, Willow's actions serve as a statement that she isn't going to be passive while her children struggle anymore. She's going to be there with them, no matter how terrified she is. And Weiss's little "I didn't forget you" moment ties the three of them up in a neat little redemption story bow. Speaking of neat, the Aesops... wow. There sure is a lot going on here. Most of it works, but I wouldn't exactly call it neat.
That's why you lost against Team RWBY. You try to fight how you feel about each other, so you'll never truly work as a team.
Ugh. Rather than treating the group like a single character and having them grow and change at the same time, which would have been the easier thing to do, they actually take the time and effort to give each of them their own separate headspace, which is impressive even if it results in certain characters like Elm getting pushed to the wayside while other characters like Harriet get all of the attention. And then there's Vine, who sacrifices himself to save them. Oh no. Not Vine. I'm sure gonna miss that guy. Harriet, Elm, and Vine's arcs work because they're only partially redemption stories. Really, they're tragedies, failures to realize something important before it's too late, leaving them ripped to shreds and dealing with the consequences of their egos. This isn't the case for Winter and Marrow, however, who are both already reluctant when the volume begins, and follow that course to its natural conclusion. I don't really have much to say about either character in that regard. Their arcs are a lot cleaner, but also a lot less remarkable. The coolest thing about them is how their treachery is revealed during a cathartic-as-all-hell fight against Ironwood. And lastly, there's Emerald, who is already feeling reluctant at the beginning of the volume and has been building to an eventual betrayal since Volume 3. That's 5 volumes ago. This final moment of redemption carries the weight of 5 volumes worth of build-up. I love how Mercury plays into how she's feeling, too. We've been watching the coworker who you get along with but also kinda hate relationship between Emerald and Mercury for years now. But while Mercury has been embracing his role as one of Salem's underlings, Emerald has been starting to question pretty much all of her life choices, and they've drifted apart due to this. But now, when Emerald is out of friends and needs someone to talk to about a horrifying worry, Mercury is the one she goes to. And of course, he's unreceptive. He writes it off as Ozpin just covering his ass. He does what he always does. He plays the tough guy. But when Tyrion shows up and gives them a reason to believe maybe Ozpin might have been telling the truth, you can see an understanding pass between them. Maybe Mercury would open up to Emerald's fears if he had a little more time, but he doesn't. Tyrion is here to drag him off to Vacuo. There isn't even time for them to continue their conversation. And as they both realize this, you can sense the longing to reach out, to say more, maybe even do something reckless. But they both hesitate too long, and before either of them know it, it's goodbye. A somber, wordless farewell, the kind you look back on and regret. Underrated moment, if you ask me. The only criticism I have of what Emerald goes through this volume is that she isn't really given a lot of opportunities to make strong choices. She kind of just ends up with Ruby and friends, which makes sense, but also isn't quite as compelling as watching her make a difficult decision would have been. By the time she gets her big good guy moment, she's already been persuaded to join the cause. So I think I would have preferred if she had decided to try to escape with Oscar on her own, rather than just going along with whatever Hazel decides is best for her. But with that, by Cthulhu, let's move on from this section already. So, I'm gonna say some bad things, but firstly, let me say that this is a huge improvement, and that I don't mean to make a habit out of bullying Cinder, I just happen to, all the time, in like every video. Please don't hate me, Cinder stans. Okay, so first of all, the big flashback. In my opinion, kind of uninspired and drab. It has the exact same problem as the backstory dump in Volume 6, which is that a lot of it is tangential to what is actually going on in the story right now. It's not nearly as bad as Volume 6, since at least this is technically digging into Cinder's psychology as it relates to Salem, which is important right now, but I would argue that most of the interesting stuff related to that happens outside the flashback anyway. Not to mention, it's also a bit awkwardly inserted. We establish that Cinder's past is on her mind right at the beginning, and then we don't hear about it for 4 episodes, and we're dealing with the Whale and the Hound and the Aesops and the Watts and the Amity, and Remnant knows about Salem now, and now Penny's hacked, and then bam, out of nowhere, here's half an episode full of backstory. Kind of a shotgun to the legs as far as pacing goes. And yeah, I didn't mention that when I was talking about the pacing earlier, sorry. It's almost like general statements about a work of storytelling don't always apply to every single moment within. So Cinder's flashback is already starting from zero in terms of investment. In other words, it needed to grab my attention, and it just kind of failed to do so. There are a couple different ways you can effectively bring a backstory like this into the main story. You can really take your time, sell us on each and every character and on the past versions of the characters we recognize, and put in the effort to make it a compelling miniature story on its own. Or you can be a bit snappier with it and focus on the dramatic current state of the character's history, so that it's less about what happened and more about how that affects them now. If you're really good, you can do both. If you're Chapter 6 of RWBY Volume 8, you can do neither. Considering that the fairy tale references are supposed to be a starting point and not a means to an end, I'm not a huge fan of how they use the Cinderella fairy tale as shorthand instead of actually doing the work. It feels like they're just waving their hands and going, yeah, she's Cinderella, so she was abused as a child by her family, and yada yada yada, evil stepmother. You get it. Yeah, I do get it, but that doesn't mean I'm interested. You've given me a state of affairs, but you've sold me on nothing. Our villains, who don't even get names, are cartoonishly evil for no fucking reason except evil stepfamily. Except I'm pretty sure the villains in Cinderella actually did have motivations in the movie. And the actual fairy tale. Anyway, the whole thing is gloriously unsubtle, and that's before they do the montage where Casey Lee Williams sings the plot at you. Then we get Cinder using her semblance, I think? Wait, has her aura been unlocked? Do you have to have your aura unlocked to get a semblance? You would think so, since I don't think you can use your semblance when your aura was broken. And why doesn't the evil stepmom seem surprised by this? Has this happened before? What the fuck is going on? Things definitely take a turn for the better once Rhodes enters, although it is immediately apparent from his design and role in the story that he's not going to make it out of the episode. Is he not going to ask about the smoke bomb thing either? Whatever, it doesn't matter. What matters is that this dude is a plain but serviceable mentor, and the premise of training her to become a huntsman even though she's still trapped in slave hell because this guy is too lawful good to just get her out is the most interesting thing to happen so far. This second montage showcases how Cinder's gratefulness towards him mixes with bitterness about how he can leave and she can't, creating impatience and pent-up fury, is some solid build-up, and then it all comes crashing down. She decides she can't take another moment of punishment and unleashes that pent-up rage on her abusers, only to immediately discover that this moment of weakness has led to her only friend turning on her, a genuinely tragic moment. Not one that I particularly care about, since I've yet to be sold on either character, but tragic nonetheless. And the rest of it tracks just as well. Cinder murders Rhodes, lashing out in fear and anger even once he assumes the battle is over, because abuse is simply what she knows. And we get that tearful smile as she realizes she is alone once again, but free for the first time. It's honestly kind of hilarious that most of the stuff with Rhodes is what works, even if I'm never all that invested, because Rhodes is the aspect of the flashback that seems to have the least to do with what she's going through right now. Because speaking of what she's going through, why did this flashback have to happen now? What is it telling us? It tells us why Cinder wants power, finally. About 6 volumes too late, if you ask me, but better late than never. Seriously though, the answer is so straightforward, I don't see the point of keeping it a mystery until now. It's pretty much exactly what I expected. In fact, I'm starting to think leaving it out may have been a production necessity, since full-blown flashbacks with completely different sets and character models weren't really a thing that RWBY did back then. But remember, we're criticizing RWBY as a work of art right now, not as a production. Anyway, the flashback also gives us an idea of how Cinder interacts with abusive, manipulative mommy figures, and yet still manages to leave me wanting more information about her psyche. But this is the one area of the flashback that actually improves the Volume 8 viewing experience, because it really highlights how effective a manipulator Salem is. We see that, for Cinder, Salem is both a source of comforting relief and of brutal punishment. Fun fact, isolating someone so that the main sources of both pain and comfort in their life come from the same place is a tactic that cult leaders use. The effect that this has on Cinder comes to light pretty directly in the narrative too, with Salem stepping back and giving Cinder a slightly longer leash right when she's on the verge of going rogue again. This abusive lover-esque dynamic between the two meshes interestingly with Cinder's relentless hunt for power, because it seems like she's simultaneously bowing her head to Salem because at least Salem is willing to be a source of pain and comfort instead of just pain, but is also hoarding power as a self-defense mechanism just in case she ever needs to go rogue again. And based on her erratic, thoughtless behavior, not to mention how she keeps coming back, she's doing all of that unconsciously, while telling herself that she's only pursuing power because she deserves it as a kind of reparation for how she has previously suffered. The manipulative monster that is Salem has her hook, line, and sinker, convincing her that this is just what she needs the same way that she did for Hazel. And honestly, that's pretty goddamn interesting. Does it fix Cinder, though? Not quite, because not only does it not make up for the 6 volumes we spent watching her without this knowledge, it also doesn't make up for the character arc she has during this volume. And by character arc, I really just mean she gets yelled at once and decides to start fighting smart. Except, wait, hasn't she already been depicted as capable of fighting smart? Wasn't the fall of Beacon at least partly her brilliant plan? Didn't she scare Ironwood into revealing the location of the Winter Maiden last volume? Not that she's consistently intelligent, as she has certainly displayed a habit of not learning from her mistakes, but that's why Watts' sick fucking burns actually getting through to her doesn't make sense to me. Her sitting down on the roof to reflect and quietly let out her emotions is a genuine surprise because the Cinder from every previous volume wouldn't have done that, and I don't think she changed that much as a result of Salem giving her the slightly longer leash she'd been asking for, which is why I feel like this isn't Cinder growing into a new person, it's Cinder getting patched. Watching her perfectly counter the evacuation plan while also getting all of the revenge she could ever want would have been much more narratively satisfying if the way she changed was more directly related to her flashback and what she went through earlier in the volume. And with that in mind, looking at this huge Cinder-centric flashback, I'm not sure we needed to dramatize all of that. By the end of it all, though it had the noble goal of making Cinder feel like a complete character, I can't help but view this whole sequence as a boring distraction that might have worked better as a series of brief flashes inserted at key moments rather than a whole dedicated flashback. We have to move on, but this is an important moment to remind you all that this is only my reading of Cinder. I just do not have the time or the interest to cover every possible interpretation of this character. If your interpretation clashes with mine, that's fine. Except of course I hate you and I'll never forgive you. Whenever Lai Ren and Nora Valkyrie get focus, it makes the show better. This is a scientifically proven fact, and therefore, according to my calculations, Ren and Nora are the real main characters. Of the two, Nora's character arc is the less complete, which is fine. This is only the beginning of a larger story for her, and as long as that story is continued in a satisfactory manner in later volumes, there's nothing wrong with leaving it hanging for now. Specifically, her character story is about self-definition. Sick and tired of Ren's shit and determined to fight for what she believes in, Nora is forced to confront the idea of going without the one person who's been by her side since childhood, which leads to the realization that she has absolutely no idea what that would look like. An arc about making sure you would be okay on your own before you attach yourself to someone else. Hell yeah. However, we quickly discover that Nora isn't quite okay on her own. Not yet, because despite her gung-ho attitude, her opinion of herself is kind of low. Luckily, Blake is here to form the thematic backbone of this entire arc based on the previous hardships she's experienced. Sometimes this show's themes feel a little kindergarten, which isn't always a bad thing. A lot of adults could actually really use a reminder about kindergarten-level truths like, I don't know, be kind to others. However, this thought about not forgetting about the rest is a genuinely clever little philosophy that's worth carrying with you. And it's clear that this is going to set the tone for Nora going forward. She needs to figure out who she is without her other half. And the first thing she does to try that is hitting an electric door. Citing the only thing she thinks she's good for, being strong and hitting stuff, Nora gives self-definition a try and it immediately almost kills her. that's going to result in some emotional scars, and of course some physical scars representing them. And so, when she and Ren reunite and she's obviously still not okay, she makes the surprisingly healthy decision to spend some time figuring herself out before entering an official relationship with someone she loves. Say what you want about kindergarten level themes, but the idea that you should love yourself before you love someone else is a mature take on a romance that has been previously painted as comically obvious and straightforward. And on the other side of that romance, you've got Ren, who almost turned evil. Seriously, there were a few moments where he started making arguments that sounded a lot like the manipulative shit the Aesops were saying to Penny, and I got seriously worried. It genuinely felt like if Ren continued on his current path, he could be an enemy. Luckily, he doesn't continue on that path, although I couldn't really tell you why. Maybe it's because his friends were willing to be patient with him, maybe it's because he stared isolation right in the face and decided it wasn't his thing, or maybe it was just because he found himself disgusted by the way the Aesops talk about human lives like they're just numbers in a report. It could be all of those things, but it's left ambiguous because we don't really see Ren's moment of decision, which is part of why I feel like this change of heart feels a little abrupt. Storytelling is chock full of characters pulling themselves out of their darkest hour and immediately soaring to new heights, but the moment of decision, of realization, the one thing that pulls them out of their funk and motivates them to keep going, is an important transition between those two states. So I think a little bit more time spent on Ren's interiority would have really helped here. Regardless, the emotional nirvana he reaches is a really heartwarming development for someone who's always been painted as being emotionally stunted, and the fact that it allows him to reprise his role as the group's steadfast source of calm support, but even better and able to zero in on emotional issues with surprising precision, is just kind of perfect for him. But if Ren is healing from a problematic ends justify the means mindset, that means that the writers probably aren't going to be interested in repeating a similar arc elsewhere in the volume. And they don't. I gotta say, y'all can be some snarky motherfuckers. Back in my video on all of the RWBY villains, I made some comments about how I hoped that General James Bane of all tables Ironwood would stay relatively close to the line between good and evil rather than turning into yet another pure evil monster. Then, in episode 1, he shot a guy who was threatening to get in his way. And immediately my comment section was flooded with people saying some variation of, well, looks like he's just a pure evil monster now. But, guys, he shot Oscar. He shot a child off a cliff with a hand cannon. Oscar survived, but that doesn't mean that Ironwood didn't intend to kill him. Shooting someone who got in his way is completely consistent with Ironwood's new philosophy. He has rejected mercy. He is the most dangerous kind of person. A man with absolute power, willing to do anything. And he stays that way throughout the whole volume. But, in an interesting mirror between Ironwood and RWBY of all people, we also see that his sanity is starting to slip as a result of the mounting pressure on his shoulders. It's a nice detail, but in my opinion it isn't enough to justify how he behaves later in the volume. Because eventually, your guys' claims about Ironwood becoming a needlessly cruel big bad kinda came true. Kind of. The thing is, this behavior doesn't come out of nowhere, because it's incredibly egotistical behavior, and Ironwood has always had an ego. It takes an inordinate amount of faith in oneself to be unwilling to trust anyone else with such a difficult and important set of tasks. But in the past, Ironwood has shown that he's capable of putting aside his ego for the sake of what's best for the people. Here, he succumbs fully and suddenly to his pride after being betrayed.
I know what's best for Alice, and I'm going to do whatever it takes to get that staff.
Which isn't exactly unfathomable, considering that Volume 7 was dedicated to showing how betrayal only reinforces his notion that his brutal way of doing things is the only way. I just think that most of us would have expected James to eventually see that the kids had a better solution than him and that resisting would only make things worse. So it feels a bit like James going from lawful evil to lawful stupid. And the last thing this series needs is another antagonist who is so evil it makes them an imbecile. Like, seriously, why did he kill Jacques? I still can't wrap my head around that. I have no idea why he would do that. Has he ever cared about revenge? Jacques wasn't in his way, he could have just walked away and let him fucking die in Atlas's fall. I don't understand why he killed him. Anyway, with that covered, let's see if we can't bring this thing home.
Oh, let's go! That's class!
Penny died! Again! They wrote a character to be cute and wholesome and to be a powerful bastion holding up the other characters' mental states, and then they killed her. Twice. But before we get to that, she also had a whole arc this volume, so let's begin at the beginning, where my criticism about how whiplash-inducing Penny's betrayal of Ironwood was at the end of Volume 7 completely falls apart after like 10 minutes. Turns out it felt sudden because it was. It was a spur-of-the-moment decision, and now that she's here with her friends instead of clinging to the chain of command and everything is going to shit, she's starting to question whether she made the right call. Not just with her choice to go with RWBY, but also with her choice to take the maiden power in the first place.
I was the protector of Mantle. But now, I am much more than that. And I wish I was not.
She chose to trust herself, and now she's faced with the consequences of that choice. A mountain of pressure on her shoulders to make sure that every decision from here on out is the right one. This leads to the culmination of the relationship arc between Penny and her father in episode 5, because with all of that pressure behind her, Penny keeps making these selfless, reckless choices that put her in the direct path of danger, and Pietro has to acknowledge that those are her choices, and that he has to let her make them. A very difficult but relatable thing for a parent to have to do. But the show would have felt toothless if their respective choices didn't have consequences, so they come immediately in the form of the virus and Penny plummeting back to Remnant, and thus the second half of Penny's arc begins. Having just found some semblance of peace with the choices she has to make, she suddenly finds her free will stripped away, and is forced to acknowledge that in taking the maiden power and putting herself in this position, she has even less humanity than she did as a battle robot working for Ironwood. She's become a piece on the chessboard, not just for the villains, but for the heroes too, and so it becomes a simultaneously internal and external battle for free will in a scenario where everyone wants to control her, where the heroes win out because they are the ones willing to support her and save her rather than simply use her. This leads us right to the moment of her death, where the chess piece on the board makes a decision of its own and changes the game. Now, I should warn you, this is where we dip into some really heavy territory, because the Gunsword Magic Force Field monster fighting show has decided it wants to talk about suicide and euthanasia. We can easily view the virus as a metaphor for depression or other traumatic factors pushing one to suicide, because that's literally what it's doing. It's invading her mind and forcing her down a path that ends in self-termination. As she herself puts it, it's a part of her that is driving her to die, and that part isn't entirely a result of the virus, but also of the pressure on her shoulders and her insecurity about her choice to take on all of this responsibility.
Kill me, and I can make sure the power goes to you.
But Nora's arc intersects beautifully with Penny's, urging her to hang on to the part of her that doesn't want to die, and proving that she has a soul, as if that needed to happen at this point. She fights off a virus using sheer force of will, just long enough for her to receive outside help that allows her to become a more complete and free version of herself. Considering all the wild-ass fantasy world shit going on around her, it's kind of amazing that the allegory of a person with suicidal thoughts based on societal pressure managing the strength to get help in part due to the aid of her friends and eventually beating those dangerous tendencies back remains so clear and undiluted. Viewing her arc from this perspective, her death by a friend's hand actually feels like the perfect end to a story arc about choice and about suicide, because in the end, it is Penny's choice and no one else's. She's conquered the external and internal pressures driving her to die, and chooses to die not because it's the easiest choice or because she views herself as an obstacle in the way of her friends' objectives, but because it's the best choice to save them. Throughout this volume and throughout Penny's entire life, she has been stifled by the circumstances of her creation, unable to live a normal life. The only exception to this has been her interactions with RWBY and the others, friends who inspire her to branch out, to be more than a machine. It's never enough to truly free her though, especially when the responsibility of being a maiden is added to her plate. And so, even though she could never really choose what her life would be like, in these final moments, Jean allows her to choose what it will mean. There's an undeniable tragic beauty to that, and I think that's why this second death hit me so much harder than the first. In my experience, the key to a good tearjerker is not just to be sad, but to be bittersweet, to contrast the cruelty and the beauty of life itself in order to bring both into sharper focus. And here, that is done beautifully. The brevity of her life, its limited nature, and the fact that she had to go through all of this shit just because of how she was born is the sad part. But despite all of that, Penny is just so damn happy that she got to live at all. She goes out with a smile on her face, completely at peace, because of what little of the world she's gotten to see with her friends. That is the kind of shit that activates the waterworks. I do have some criticisms, though. It may seem to contradict the point I was just making, but I think they could have played up the tragedy of this occurrence a little better. The fact that her death is so divorced from the entire concept of Ruby Rose seems to be a plot necessity. After all, if Ruby was there, Penny probably would have just given the maiden powers to her instead of Winter. And Winter receiving the powers even after rejecting the path that Ironwood chose for her and being all like, "This was a gift." That shit rules, so we don't want to lose that. But it still sucks that Ruby isn't around, or even mentioned. Besides, a lot of the analysis I did above are things that occurred to me while thinking about her death after the fact, rather than things that were on my mind while I was actually watching it. I told myself I wouldn't do this in this video, but I can't help it, so allow me to propose a slight tweak. Steal the best line from the end credits song and stick it in there as a message to Ruby when Penny is talking to Winter during that little neural handshake moment. Hey, I don't know what happened to Ruby, but if you manage to find her, could you pass along a message? Tell her, even if I couldn't live for real, it was worth it to know you. That is the kind of heart-twisting moment that I think her death is lacking, and one that directly highlights what it is about this that is so damn bittersweet. There's also the criticism going around that her death was pointless, and I'm gonna level with you. I've never understood this one. Whether we're talking about RWBY, or the Finn and Rose arc in The Last Jedi, or something else, I do not understand what pointless is supposed to mean. Like, if you have actual problems with an arc or a character or a plot point, fine, but pointless? What kind of criticism even is that? I'm pretty sure the point is to tell a story. Is every B-plot pointless just because it doesn't have anything to do with the main story? Are characters pointless just because they don't succeed at their goals? I get the idea of using the word pointless when you're talking about extraneous fat, largely unrelated to the rest of the narrative that should have been cut, but when you're leveling it as a criticism at something that is obviously integral to how the plot is weaved together or what the writers were trying to do thematically, what does that even mean? I think the real question that people are asking when they say that sort of thing is, what did this do for the narrative? In universe, Penny's death prevents Cinder from taking the power for herself and allows the Winter Maiden to save the evacuees in Vacuo. The evacuees. Kill me, please kill me. But what is the purpose of Penny's death in the story itself? There needed to be consequences for Cinder's victory to give it narrative weight, but why Penny? Was her death pointless? Well, we don't know yet. We don't know what this death does for the narrative because the volume ends almost immediately afterwards. It's going to be on volume 9 to make sure that this works as a story point, something with far-reaching effects. It needs to matter that Winter is the maiden instead of Penny. Matter that Ruby was once again absent for the death of a friend that she thought she had back. And matter that Jean was the one who dealt the killing blow. If none of that comes to pass, then that's a problem with volume 9, or 10, or however many volumes. If a story isn't finished coming out yet, it generally doesn't make sense to criticize it for being unfinished. But maybe that's just me, and maybe they'll handle this development well, or maybe about as poorly as they handled the after effects of Pyrrha's death in volume 4. Who knows? All I can say for now is that I am going to dearly miss our adorable robot friend. So what the fuck was the point of all of that? Because even after all that, I cannot figure out a conclusive ending statement for this volume. It was so packed with story that one time I tried summarizing it to a friend who hadn't seen it, and even though I was rushing, it took like 30 minutes. This video is over 50 minutes, and I didn't even have the time to talk about the Hound, or about Neo, or about my praise for and criticism of how the final episodes are structured. I couldn't find any space for my university thesis about RWBY's approach to action design, and don't even get me started on the score. Seriously, don't. I can't bear to edit this thing any longer. To be honest with you, My feelings towards this volume are pretty lukewarm. My immense love for some of its moments and complete hatred for others kind of cancel each other out, so at the end of the day, I just think it was alright. Which is why I don't think I can bring myself to end this video with some pithy statement about how the future looks bright, or how they've still got a long way to go, or how this is a step in the right direction, or a wrong direction, or whatever. This was a decent season of Western anime, and for the purposes of this fandom's enjoyment, that's all it needed to be.